Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Ludis. I am the Executive Director of the Pell Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome this crowd tonight. This is an event that we've been looking forward to since we planned it in the summer. We had a feeling that this issue was not going to go away. Unfortunately, we were right. But we have two tremendous guests with us tonight, whose full bios are in the program, but they're friends and neighbors of ours. They've both been here at the Pell Center before. Dr. Hayat Alvi teaches the Theater Security and National Security Decision-Making courses at the Naval War College. She's a regional expert and a tremendous colleague and friend. We're thrilled to have her here tonight. And to her left is my old friend and colleague and former office mate a lifetime ago, Tim Hoyt, from the U.S. Naval War College. He's been there since 2002, and he teaches in the Strategy and Policy Department. Both tremendous experts, great neighbors, and grateful to have them here. Their full bios are in the program, and I invite you to take a look, but in the interest of getting right to the good stuff, we want to get started. We're going to play here just for a moment. We had a brief conversation about how do we try to capture the complexity of the situation in Syria in particular in a forum like this. And our best solution was an internet video. So it's a 90-second BBC produced video that does a pretty nice job actually of explaining, at least giving us sort of the players. So we're going to start with that, and then we'll get into the program.
So, who's fighting who in Syria? Well, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is facing an armed uprising in his own country. He's been trying to crush it with help from his friends, Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah from Lebanon. On the other side, the US, Turkey, and the Gulf Arabs, and most of the Western world, want Assad to go. They've been arming and training many of the rebels to try to unseat him. The trouble is, one of the main insurgent groups is the so-called Islamic State, who everyone hates, including the other rebels. So now, everyone is all on the same side against IS, right? Well, not quite. Russia says it's bombing IS, but it has also bombed some of the other rebel groups fighting Assad. Some of them are being funded by Gulf countries, like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who are rivals of Iran. Meanwhile, the Turks want Assad gone, but they're not bombing him yet. Instead, they're bombing IS a bit, but also bombing the Kurds a lot, who are enemies of Assad, IS and Turkey. But the Kurds are backed by the Americans, who are allies with Turkey. So in sum, Washington's friends are fighting each other, who are both also fighting America's main enemy, which in turn is fighting Assad. Simple, it isn't.
So now, to get us started, Dr. Alvi, you have some thoughts you want to share with us to get us started?
Yeah, so can everyone hear me okay? All right, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting us. I have a few structured comments in my opening remarks. Yes, I haven't forgotten, thank you. And it begins with a disclaimer, and it's for both of us that everything we say tonight, everything from beginning to end, will be our personal views only, and not those of the Naval War College or U.S. Department of Navy or Department of Defense or the government. We're required to give that disclaimer. What I want to begin with is a very quick synopsis of what the title you've given for our talk is about, and I tried very hard to link it to the main theme of the title, the legacy, what's next for U.S. policy in the Middle East. So bear with me, I have a few structured comments, and then what I'll do is I'll tag team over to Dr. Hoyt, who will continue talking about mostly external or foreign elements and actors involved in the region. So I want to start with current events, because news broke just yesterday, and that's a hard part of being in our field, which is every few seconds news breaks. So we have to, you can imagine how hard it is for us to publish things, right? And get things published because they get outdated in a matter of days. Yesterday, news broke that the U.S. is sending a new force of special operations troops to Iraq to fight against ISIS. You can call it ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever you want to call it. I think we all understand who we're talking about. This will consist of raids, military raids, special operations raids in both Syria and Iraq, but based in Iraq, going after ISIS. The special operations forces will consist of a number of roughly, Reuters said, 200, just about 200. However, there's a twist in this. There's always a twist in the Middle East. Iraq's Prime Minister Abadi said, such a force is not acceptable, not without Iraq's approval. Reading Reuters, it says, Abadi is requiring approval because of Iraqi sovereignty before U.S. Special Operations Forces are allowed in Iraq. This raises questions, and here I'm quoting Reuters, raises questions over how closely Washington coordinated the plan with Baghdad. By the way, powerful Shia militias in Iraq heard about this. More American forces are coming on the ground, and they have pledged to fight any new deployment of U.S. forces in the country. It goes on to say that the spokesman for Iraqi Kataib Hezbollah, which is the Iraqi Shia militia called Hezbollah, the spokesman Jafar Hosseini said that any such U.S. force would become, quote, a primary target for our group. We fought them before, and we are ready to resume fighting, unquote. This is a snapshot, just a snapshot of the blurred lines, the confusion, the fluidity, and the clashing interests in the region. This is what the video tried to convey as well. We have a couple of maps as well. If you want to put them up, you're welcome to do so. Just to give you an idea, again, how confusing the number of actors just in Syria and Iraq alone that are regional actors and Syrian and Iraqi actors, and then Dr. Hoyt will talk about some of the foreign players involved as well. I think our main word of the evening is confusing or confusion. Regional security is really deteriorating as we speak. I'm going to begin that kind of beginning of the deterioration with the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, as the backdrop. It's certainly not the very beginning. If you want to go back to the very beginning, go all the way back to the 7th century. But we don't have time tonight. So we'll begin with the Arab Spring 2011, early 2011. And from that, we've extracted 3 main threads or themes about what has happened from 2011 to today. The 3 themes or threads are political disillusion, the issue of borders, and the Sunni-Shia rivalry. Out of the 3, the only one that has clarity arising from the fog of war today is the Sunni-Shia rivalry. Everything else falls back into the confusion, the fog of war, and the blurred lines. Political dissolution begins with the Arab Spring. At least that's the starting point of our discussion. People in the region were discontented. They had very serious grievances. I am not going to go into the details of the causes and the lead up to the Arab Spring, which begins in Tunisia, but it does have a domino effect that you have to bear in mind for today's discussion. This is where, because all 3 of these themes and threads are interrelated, it leads into the borders issue, because the Arab Spring did not see really, in terms of inspiration, any borders. It just simply inspired people from Tunisia to Egypt to Libya, and of course Syria and other countries as well. So the political dissolution leads to the border challenges, and then you have the rise of ISIS. You can say around the time of June 2014. But of course, the lead up is and the cause of the rise of ISIS, all of that precedes June of 2014. And I'll leave that for Q&A. We can talk about that. Another thing related to borders is how porous they've become today. Not just the fact that ISIS has literally erased the Syrian-Iraqi border, and they use bulldozers in front of cameras to make a dramatic effect in their propaganda videos showing that, look, we're erasing the border between Syria and Iraq. But they also, because of the Syrian civil war and their takeover of Mosul in Iraq and subsequent events, have led to such porous borders with a tremendous flow, as you know from headlines, in the entire Levant region, and even into the Fertile Crescent region, and even in Turkey, as you read in the papers, where you have a flow of arms, people, goods, artifacts, and a whole host of other things. Of course, the refugee crisis is related to that, but so are so many other things, including tunnels, including hostage-taking and kidnappings, etc. So again, political disillusion, I would argue, is still there in the region. It has not been resolved because of the Arab Spring and the revolutions and uprisings that came after. And the Syrian civil war is a major piece in this whole discussion. The rise of ISIS, the dissolving of borders, or the insignificance of borders is another one. The Sunni-Shia rivalry, I'll simply say it this way. When you peel all these onions in all of these conflicts and crises, plural, it boils down to the geopolitical interests and sectarian rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, hence the Sunni-Shia rivalry. And that's the only one that's bearing more clarity in my argument, in my view, than anything else going on, as you saw from the video. A last few notes on U.S. national interests and legacies relative to the region. Well, historically, we have a long list of national interests. And I thought about that starting point around modern history, let's say around the Cold War era. So you have an interest in power projection on the part of the United States in the Middle East. Of course, oil is there. Geopolitical interests like the integrity of the Suez Canal remaining open, Cold War politics at the time, and then other kind of rising national interests after the Cold War that we can talk about. And of course, there's the constant of Israel's national security and regional security that affects Israel's security. Add to that list today, that list of U.S. national interests, and of course it's not a complete list, but these are some of the major national interests that I came up with. Today you add to that list counterterrorism and everything related to terrorism. Arms race, something we neglect in the media, we neglect to see. The media is just not putting a spotlight on, which is the foreign military sales, the almost default and knee-jerk reaction on the part of Western powers, not just the U.S., France, UK, others are guilty of it too, that we'll just sell more weapons to the regional allies and maybe that'll take care of the problem, including with ISIS. And I put a question mark on the third one, which is democracy promotion, because part of the problem is the values connected with foreign policy of the U.S., which has never went across, never materialized in a very positive way on the ground. And we can talk about that. But one good example, of course, is, or bad example, depending on how you view it, is the 2003 invasion of Iraq. I was in Egypt at the time, and many of the editorials coming out of the region simply said, you can't bring democracy at the barrel of a gun. So those are some of the major U.S. national interests relative to the region. As an analyst, I see a lot of disconnects in what our current policy is, United States policy is, and again, this is personal opinions and views, relative to what's happening on the ground in the region. Number one, and I see this in regional public opinion in social media quite a bit, and that is the United States' narrow focus on going after ISIS as opposed to doing something about Assad, who the majority of the Sunnis in the region see as not just a monster, but a war criminal. The other disconnect, U.S. supplies and or weapons frequently falling into the wrong hands. Did you have my slide picture? The very first one, the cover slide with the tanks?
We did not.
Oh, you did not? Okay.
I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. Okay, so I had a picture of, one picture was of a soldier from Jaish al-Fatah, which is a conglomerate of Islamist militias in Syria fighting against Assad. And that soldier is standing in front of an American Humvee, which was confiscated in their battles against Shia militias in Syria. It's a great picture. Another picture next to it was a tank, an American tank, that should have been used by the Iraqi military, but instead a fighter, an Iraqi Shia militia fighter, is sitting in front of it, and he has draped the Iraqi Hezbollah flag over the tank. So American weapons, unfortunately, and supplies tend to fall into the wrong hands. U.S. military on the ground is not considered so far by the Obama administration as quote-unquote combat. Domestically, this can become problematic. So there's another disconnect there. We're not unmindful of the fact that the war with ISIS is also going on in cyberspace, especially in social media. But unfortunately, we are outpaced and outnumbered in that domain, and we can talk about that. So there's a disconnect there as well. The last disconnect on my list is that regional actors have their own national interests and agendas relative to Iraq, relative to Syria, relative to ISIS, relative to each other. And our policymakers tend to forget that or miss that or not place enough weight on that when designing and coming up with new strategies and policies to deal with ever-increasing crises and problems in the region. So what are our policy options as we move forward? What's the future legacy and policy of the United States? Well, I'll leave you with this, and then I turn it over to Dr. Hoyt. We can talk about in Q&A all kinds of policy options that even some of the U.S. presidential candidates are talking about, and other politicians in D.C. I'll leave that for a later discussion, but my closing thoughts are the following. There is no purely military solution to ISIS. We can throw so much weaponry and ground troops and other airstrikes, and the UK just joined, again, the extension of airstrikes from the UK against ISIS, etc. And Germany is on board as well, as I understand it from the news. But there's no purely military solution to this problem. It's a war of ideas, folks. It's a war of ideas. And I'll leave you with this very uncomfortable thought. And with the caveat, please don't assume it's a generalization. But the uncomfortable thought is this, because we're coming full circle back to Arab Spring, and I hope you can see the connection. The idea of a caliphate is attractive to many, especially because of bad governance of regional actors in the Middle East. This is precisely why the Arab Spring happened in the first place.
Okay, and I'll try and pick up and run from there. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. Trying to use the mic better? Okay. If not, I'll just yell. I'm an opera singer by trade, so you'll hear me eventually. Let me start with the countries that Hayat has begun with, Iraq and Syria, and then move out, because all of the countries in the region have significant national interests, and the problem that we face today, which is a fundamental problem and one that will not go away easily, is that almost all of the countries in the region have different priorities than we do. And the things that they prioritize more highly are things that we do not prioritize, or that we are trying to minimize the effects of. So starting with Iraq, until Saddam Hussein was overthrown, Iraq was critical to the balance of power in the Persian Gulf region. Iraq was the state that was strong enough to act as a buffer in the Sunni-Shia conflict and in a long-term but fairly peaceful competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It was able to do that because Saddam was an authoritarian dictator who ran a minoritarian regime. The Sunni population on which his rule was based and from which the majority of military and political leadership was drawn is between 20 and 25% of the population. Most of the population is Shia. However, as long as Saddam was in power, Iraq as a state acted as a buffer against Iran, which was seen as a threatening Shia power by the rest of the region. When Saddam fell, Iraq's role as a buffer collapsed. As a result, the Gulf states have gotten much more active, militarily, diplomatically, in terms of covert operations and financing of militant groups throughout the region. Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and to a certain extent the UAE, are now using the Syrian civil war as a proxy conflict to tie up Iranian forces and resources and to attack Assad, who they haven't really liked for some time anyway, and who has made a situation worse in the civil war by extremely repressive measures against the civilian population. Over 250,000 dead in the Syrian civil war since 2012. He's responsible for well over half of those. Syria fell apart on its own. But as a result of falling apart in these circumstances, it created an opportunity for the dissolution of the border. The northwest of Iraq is primarily Sunni. The people there have been nervous about a new Shia government taking over in Iraq. They've been increasingly nervous about Sunnis being pushed out of positions of political authority, of Sunni militias that had been established by the US being defunded by the new Iraqi government. And so as a result, you have a strong backlash of Sunni separatism in northwest Iraq, which goes across the border and made contact with Sunni radicals in Syria as well. This is one of the origins of ISIS that Hayat was talking about. What that's led to is a mess in Syria, and no one has a good solution for that. There appears to be no short-term solution. US preferences are both to eliminate ISIS and to get rid of Assad. Those are mutually contradictory in many respects. They certainly exhibit an enormous amount of cognitive dissonance, because those are the two primary poles of power, and if it's not one of the two of them, I don't know who it's going to be. We continue to search for moderate Syrians, but we haven't had a lot of luck with that yet. Moving further out, Turkey has become a major player in the Middle East for the first time in a generation. Part of the reason it's become a major player is because it opposed Assad. Part of the reason it's become a major player is because knowingly or unknowingly, it allowed recruits for ISIS to flow across its territory, although it is now taking much more significant measures to stop that. And it's very worried about Kurds, and there are Kurds in Iraq and Iran and in Syria, and if you read the newspapers, you'll see lots of people saying that the Kurds are the only people we can rely on. They're our allies in the region, so we should ally with the Kurds. Well, if we do that, we will then threaten our real allies, who are the Turks, who are a NATO member, right? So you only got part of the complication in the 90-second video. This is enormously complicated. The Israelis are unclear about who they want to win in this conflict. They didn't necessarily like Assad, but they had learned to live and work with him. Assad imposed a certain stability over Syrian foreign policy that is now gone. They are very worried about Iranian connections with Hezbollah and appear to have cut a separate deal with the Russians so that they can bomb allies of Assad that are getting arms from allies of Russia. Everybody followed that? And actually who the Israelis are most worried about is indeed Iran. And they're more worried about Iranian influence than anything else. Last but not least, Russia has intervened. And this makes life really tough. First off, because anytime the Russians show up anywhere in the world, we immediately start thinking about the Cold War. It's a reflex action. And especially when they're in the Middle East, which was where a lot of the give and take during the Cold War at the height in the 1970s and 1980s was taking place. We get very worried when the Russians show up. And the Russians have a profound interest in keeping Assad in power. That's significant. At the same time, the Russians have helped us on important things. We drew a red line in the sand over Syrian chemical weapons, which was the last time I appeared in front of this audience. I'm hoping I'm not going to cause another crisis by showing up this time. But the Russians were the ones who intervened with us to help us get the Syrians to dismantle most of their chemical weapons complex. So even though we have competing interests, we also have shared interests, and the Russians have been helpful. The Russians may be helpful again if our primary interest is simply to end the Syrian civil war. That is something the Russians would like to do as well. So this is both an opportunity and a crisis. The reason we know it's a crisis is because last week our Turkish allies shot down a Russian plane that flew over Turkish airspace. Now, that's a NATO-Russia clash. Remember how I said we always freak out and immediately revert back to the Cold War? Well, unfortunately, it's a little too real this time. We have a NATO member which has shot down Russian aircraft. This is a very complex situation, and it's not easy to see either viable short-term solutions that will resolve major problems or viable long-term solutions that we can work toward because of the complexity of the situation. There are so many actors with so many competing interests. I know that's not what you want to hear. At the same time, it's a reality that we're going to have to work with, and we're going to have to work with it over the next year, which, by the way, is an election year. So you are going to hear the most wild and crazy proposals and a constant stream of critiques against the administration for not doing enough. The problems in this region are not going to go away. They will be with the next administration and the one after that. But it's important to realize how complex it is, which may begin to explain why both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, in many respects, took a very hands-off policy on aspects of problems here, because they felt like anything they did was worse than what was already going on. And that's a very complex environment to live in. So, Jim.
So, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the show? So, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then I'm going to do my Jimmy Fallon impersonation, run around with a microphone.
No Jimmy Fallon. You're no Jimmy
well,
Fallon.
it's true in a lot of ways. But I want to start sort of with some strategic issues. A graduate of both the War College and Salve Regina University is General Tony Zinni. And a decade ago, Zinni was running around D.C. saying, we're talking about the collapse of the regional security structure. What's going to follow it? What are we doing now to put it in its place? And the short answer was, well, nothing. And Tim, the reality that you sketched out of this conflict, this proxy war between the Sunni and Shia, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, is a regional security issue. All this talk, all this debate about what's happening in Syria seems to be about rearranging chairs on the deck of the Titanic when your problem's the iceberg. So what do we do about the iceberg?
Well, there is no good solution right now for the Sunni-Shia divide. I mean, first off, this is rooted in the Islamic faith since roughly the middle of the 8th century AD. And there's nothing that we can do to resolve that. What we can do is try and find ways to ameliorate immediate conflict between Iran and Syria, or between Iran and Saudi Arabia, excuse me, and particularly the arms race dynamic. This is one of the reasons I think that the Obama administration has placed so much emphasis on the nuclear deal, which we didn't even mention as we discussed this. But Iran with nuclear weapons changes the regional balance of power even more fundamentally, and will send a lot of states in the Gulf scurrying to find something that will be the equivalent, either a nuclear weapon or extremely advanced conventional weapons. So one of the things that we are doing, if it works, and no one is sure that it will work yet, to mitigate this Sunni-Shia rivalry, or at least keep it at a more manageable level, is trying to keep Iran from becoming a nuclear power. If we fail to do that, then things really get bad in the region. Right now it is still a proxy conflict waged on other people's territory. If that nuclear balance changes, it may become a proxy conflict waged on each other's territory, and that could be much more complicated. There are large Shia minorities in Saudi Arabia, a Shia majority in Bahrain. There's a lot of opportunity for this to spread in nasty ways. So again, part of our problem is we're a status quo power. We would like stability. But it's very hard to have stability when every time we try and do something with Iran that will make it look less aggressive, alarms all of our traditional allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because they believe that we are about to turn to Iran as the regional hegemon because, well, we've done it before. So it's complicated.
Well, so, and Hayat, this leads me back to the Arab Spring in particular, and the president's speech in Cairo, the intervention in Libya, the threatened intervention early, the red line in Syria. There has been an interventionism streak in the Obama administration, at least early in its tenure, that belies the fact that we're a status quo power. How did that evolution take place? Is this the legacy that the Obama administration leaves behind?
Well, to begin with the iceberg, I'm convinced that it's cloning itself in the region. So you're going to see multiple icebergs. And one thing that is manifesting that is the absolutely no focus in the media, in the Western media, on the Yemen situation, because the Yemen war is devastating. The Obama 2009 speech in Cairo was very pivotal. And remember I said question mark democracy promotion? Well, a lot of what he said was, and you can look up the transcript, was about supporting democracy in the region and democracy in the Middle East to flourish and blossom. Well, we kind of tracked ourselves into those verbal footsteps with the Arab Spring and especially the Libya case, with a heavy dose of confusion of what to do. Because once it came to Tunisia, everyone applauded. That's a great, example of grassroots mobilization to get rid of a really nasty dictator. And Tunisia is really tiny, and that's very palatable. Then it goes to Egypt. Well, Mubarak was a long-time U.S. ally. Mubarak is not someone who's immediately viewed as expendable. And then the people on the ground in the Tahrir Square movement were scratching their heads and saying, what happened to the Obama speech, Cairo speech, that talked about democracy in Egypt, right, and in the Middle East? So even though the 11th hour decision came, even though in the inner circle of the Obama administration, at the time Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates, etc., they were not completely agreed. They didn't have a consensus on what to do with Mubarak. This upset the Tahrir Square activists. And even though it was an 11th hour Obama decision to say, yes, Mubarak must go, that clock ticking to the 11th hour really upset a lot of Egyptian activists. So the bottom line answer to your question, with a kind of a preface to my answer, which is it's a no-win situation for the U.S. when it comes to the Middle East, to be fair to us, which is It's always a catch-22. If we do something, we get criticized and upset the public opinion. If we don't do something, we get criticized and get an upset public opinion. But the problem, having lived in the region, the main grievance that I heard from Egyptians, Jordanians, Syrians, etc., is the say-do gap. We say we support democracy and human rights, but how it manifests itself in foreign policy, bilateral as well as multilateral, is a disconnect. And people notice on the ground, and they don't like it.
So on a more operational level, and I would defer to either of you, after the attacks in Paris, airstrikes in Syria picked up. There was a report that American aircraft attacked and destroyed 237, that number I'm pulling out of thin air, but it was over 200 tanker vehicles used for ISIL's, Daesh, their illicit trade in oil. What have we been waiting for?
I think the official explanation, which in some ways is understandable, we don't want to destroy a lot of the infrastructure because we are technically allied with Iraq, and we want Iraq to regain control of those areas and to reestablish its borders. So we're trying to fight a war without causing a lot of civilian casualties, but also without causing a lot of infrastructure damage, which is the infrastructure that ISIL is using to fund all of its operations. Again, there's a level of cognitive dissonance there that's distinguishable. At the same time, you can understand, I mean, the Iraqis have been promising for a year that they will begin to launch the great offensives that will take back all this territory from ISIL. And presumably the day that happens, the United States has the capability to ramp up support for that ground offensive. Until that ground offensive happens, however, we don't want to destroy the area that Iraq is going to want to take back and then govern. Because the big issue here is, how do you govern it afterwards? And if you've destroyed the economic infrastructure, it will be a problem.
May I add, I always emphasize, do not view anything in the region as monolithic. We have interests in supporting the Kurds, but the Kurds own a lot of the oil territory in Iraq. The latest headlines are the Kurds and the Shia militias in Iraq are fighting each other because of this. Nothing is black and white. Even there are Kurds who are members of ISIS, and they have propaganda. ISIS has propaganda, video propaganda of their fighters with Kurdish prisoners, Peshmerga fighters, in cages. And the guy with the mic speaking, who's an ISIS fighter for doing the propaganda video, is speaking in Kurdish language, and he's a member of ISIS. So just a caution that nothing is black and white. It's very much the opposite of a monolithic lens.
So I'm going to come around for questions in about 30 seconds, or as soon as they're done answering. So if you've got a question, hand up, and I'll come to you with a microphone. And I would just ask everybody to remember to make it a question. It ends with a question mark. How does this end? If you sort of hit fast forward on this and we stay on this trajectory, are we looking at another decade of conflict? Are we looking at, conflict of indeterminate length, or is there an end game in sight?
So I lived in Syria under Hafiz al-Assad, the father of the current dictator, and fast forward to when the Syrian civil war broke out in 2011, and people would come up to me or talk in discussions and say, Bashar al-Assad will fall in 6 months or 3 months or within a year, and I would laugh, because I knew the capabilities of the Assad regime, and I knew that he's not a Gaddafi, and he has powerful friends backing him, Russia and Iran, and this is not going to be a walk in the park. And I always describe it as, if you thought the Lebanese civil war, which lasted 15 years, was bad in comparison to Syria and what's going on and what will happen, yes, decades from now, the continuation of the bloodshed. Given just the sheer number of actors fighting, I looked it up. I came across a list online of all the fighters on all sides, including ISIS and the Syrian opposition, more than 30 pages. I wanted to read it to you. I looked at the 30 pages. I didn't even want to print it. It was way too much. So that alone, so the Lebanese Civil War, it's gonna, the Syrian Civil War is gonna make the Lebanese Civil War look like, just a blink of an eye, in my opinion.
I think one of the most powerful metaphors that analysts have used when they're discussing what's going on in Syria and Iraq right now is to say that Islam has begun its 30 years war.
Yeah.
That might be a way of thinking about it, that you have a conflict that is not solely about religious division, but which is fueled by religious division, and which then overlaps issues of borders, issues of sovereignty, issues of government, issues of territorial control and resources. I don't know if it will be a 30-year war or not, but I think there are good reasons to suspect that this is going to go on for a decade or more.
I totally agree with that analogy, because it goes also to that war of ideas, which is internal to Islam first, and then, of course, outside of Islam as well.
Okay, over to you folks. Coming up.
Dr. Hoyt, I was encouraged by 2 points you made. One, that our goals of fighting ISIS and also trying to get rid of Assad are in conflict.
Yeah.
Kind of suggests the possibility that we have to make a choice. And I think the other point that you made was encouraging is that Russia's helped us before.
Yeah.
And and perhaps we should capitalize on that and figure out a way to work as a partner with Russia. So my question to you is, kind of spell out the implications if indeed we just drop the whole policy, the whole question of throwing out, getting rid of Assad, and instead our goal is to destroy ISIS, whether we're successful or not. That's our goal. And then spell out, if you would, the implications of that in terms of our relationships with the Sunni countries, the players in the area. Could you please?
Well, I can give you some guesses. And this is one of the problems, I think, as we look at the region. We can probably identify 5 or 6 possible futures, depending on American decisions, but then looking at the consequences tells us something about the risks of making those decisions. In this case, we already can see some indication that the administration may be thinking about doing this sequentially. Trying to figure out how to deal with both Assad and ISIS, but only deal with them one at a time. And what we're seeing, that is coming up in discussions about ending the civil war, where the Russians and others have said, well, maybe we'll need to leave Assad in power for a time. And Secretary Kerry made some noises that did not sound like that's absolutely inconceivable, but instead sounded like, well, that might be negotiable. That would then allow us to concentrate on ISIS and do this as a sequential effort. Take out ISIS first, then worry about Assad. However, if we are to do that, my bet would be that the immediate response from some of our traditional partners in the region would be to amp up support to Sunni elements in Syria, and possibly even either unofficially or covertly amp up support to ISIS in order to keep Assad under pressure and to continue to tie up Iranian resources and, by the way, Hezbollah resources, because Hezbollah has suffered enormous losses fighting for Assad in Syria. So there are other players in the region who want to see the civil war go on. If we make the decision, we'll cut a deal with Assad to end the civil war so we can focus on ISIS. Some of our partners may not agree with that, and it may therefore not happen. So that's a future. If everything works well, it could be a good solution. My fear is that there are many obstacles, And many of our partners now are playing this game a lot harder than they ever have in the past. The Gulf states are much more involved in the region with covert aid and military aid and training. What we want, they may not, and therefore we may not get it.
Right. The last round of talks, in fact, that were attempts at solving the Syrian civil war did not even include any representatives from the opposition.
Yeah.
So that's a non-starter. Also, to add and reinforce what my colleague said, ISIS is an existential threat to Shias and in particular Iran. That's a huge tool in your toolbox if you really hate Iran and you're involved in that Sunni-Shia rivalry. Why would it be in your interest to see ISIS eliminated if they are the number one existential threat to Iran? ISIS's number one priority is to commit genocide of Shias. It's not to attack U.S., and it does that on the side, in the propaganda and all, but its number one grievance, if you want to call it that, or its number one bloodlust, is to commit genocide of Shias.
So if you've got a question, again, catch my eye, and I'll come up to you. I'll catch you. We're going to go right here for the next one.
Thank you. A question to you. If we go back to Al-Qaeda and 9/11, we find that of the 15 terrorists who did that, 9 were Saudis and 3 Yemenis who had been trained in Saudi Arabia. If we take all the major terrorist activities in the last 15 years, 20 years, from the bombing the bar in Jakarta, Indonesia, to bombing the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, to bombing the USS Cole, and we can go on down the whole list. Every single one of those activities or actions was created by somebody who had been trained in jihadist theology in Saudi Arabia by the Wahhabis there. Today we are trying to fight ISIS. Last decade's flavor was Al-Qaeda. This decade's flavor is ISIS. 10 years from now it will be something else, more virulent, more difficult. Until we hit the source of the problem, the cancer will continue to spew. My question is, why have we refused to address the core problem, which is the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, supported by the Saudi government, who are the cause or the fountain from which all of this is coming? We keep hitting the symptoms, but the core seems to be left alone. What do you say to that?
In my personal opinion, I'd like to know the answer too. Because I've been saying that for a very long time. And again, personal opinion here. Long time I've been saying that. In fact, since the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan, I've been saying that, shouting from the rooftops. I guess no one's been listening to little me. But I'll tell you something. It's really funny and sad at the same time. Over the last weekend, on Twitter, there were, and in the news, there were news headlines that Saudi Arabia, and I think it was in the Washington Post, is threatening to sue a Twitter user for comparing Saudi to ISIS. And on Twitter, this unleashed and triggered a hashtag that trended throughout the entire weekend globally, that was hashtag Saudi is ISIS or something. I forgot the exact wording. And it circulated. So people globally are aware of this. It's governments and policymakers that have to really embrace this, understand it. And once they understand it, they'll start to see the other disconnects and start making them more clear about what are the actual agendas and intentions of our so-called partners and allies in the region. Again, it's the superimposition of the Sunni-Shia rivalry that has reached such a, I like your use of the word cancer. It's a cancerous stage. It's so venomous. And by the way, it's equally bad on the Shia side. Some of the Shia militias that are supposedly fighting on our side, not so overtly, but using our equipment sometimes and our assistance through the Iraqi military, those are as nasty guys as ISIS. I'll give you an example, and you can look this up if you like, from very reliable sources. When they captured one Sunni fighter in Iraq, they actually cooked him over a fire pit, alive. So these guys are just as nasty and bad as the Wahhabi counterparts.
I don't have great answers for you, sir. I would say if there was a time where we felt we could trace the root of this problem primarily to Saudi Arabia, I'm afraid that time is past. ISIS is not the result of Saudi training. It may be affected by Wahhabi or Salafist religious ideas, but it is an Iraqi group. And the leaders of ISIS, many of them are actually former members of the Ba'ath Party. So this is a problem that is, if there ever was a single point that we could go to resolve it, I think that time probably was a generation ago. And now we're at the point where we would have to look perhaps in Saudi Arabia, but also in Pakistan, and in Syria, and in Iraq, and with Shia groups in Iran. The bitterness and hatred that has emerged in this generation would have been unthinkable to people who lived in the region in the 1970s before the Iranian Revolution. We're looking at a sea change over the course of 2 generations that no longer, there's no longer an easy place to point to and say it's their fault. We thought it was Iran's fault for a long time, for instance. It's no longer easy to do that. I think that this is now a more widespread problem, and that is one of the things that makes it so difficult to combat.
We've got a question in the back here.
I would agree that the 7th century, excuse me, certainly sowed the seeds of this dissent and conflict. But I think that if we look forward to the First World War and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, I think that the Western powers actually created what we have today. And I'm not sure I would agree with you completely that it hasn't been festering since the First World War. And it was just certain lids were put on it for a certain period of time. It was going to happen. As a long shot, do you think there might well be a geographical solution, given the fact that the Western powers created a geographical problem?
Well, it's interesting because ISIS itself and its propaganda is one of its most popular banners, uses the expression, "We will erase Sykes-Picot." And that's why I said a Sykes-Picot agreement. It was a 1916 secret agreement between Britain and France to literally carve up the borders and territories as they are today, as they exist today for the most part, as they saw the Ottoman Empire collapsing in the Middle East and North Africa. So France got mainly the Levant, Syria and Lebanon today, and Britain got...
First World War you're talking
Correct, right, 1916, correct. So it's called a Sykes-Picot Agreement, and ISIS does its homework, folks. They know what they're doing in their propaganda, and the moment they present with grand graphics in their videos that we are going to erase Sykes-Picot, and they say this very repetitively in multiple languages, right? It's attractive because of exactly the same reason you said. Not only did Western powers create these borders and problems, but then the post-border creation interventions have not actually been very wholesome either, right? So we were just talking before the talk, and that is, mentioning how long the memories of the people in the region are, as opposed to our memories in American culture. Their memories go back to Sykes-Picot, they go back to the 7th century, and it carries on from generation to generation. So is there a geographic solution? Well, ISIS is presenting one. Unfortunately, it's attractive. A lot of people like the idea. Now, that doesn't mean they'll drop what they're doing and join, but they like the idea. Kind of sitting on the sidelines, right? Maybe watching it on social media, etc., and applauding it on the sidelines. What can regional actors do? Well, they're going to, I think Dr. Hoyt might agree with me, they're going to very aggressively protect what they have. And again, it goes back to the clash of national interests then, right? So even within Iraq, you see the Kurds have a different national interest or agenda than, let's say, the Shia militias do, as opposed to the Sunni Arabs, etc. So it gets very dicey and complicated. It's not a neat and clean. Even the former Yugoslavia is still having problems. If you look at what the condition and status of Bosnia and Serbia is today, it's not a clean, resolution.
I would just say on the geography, it is possible again to envision another future. A future where the border between Iraq and Syria dissolves and you have a Sunni state that is based on the territory of ISIL today. You have a rump Syria on the coast. You might even have a Kurdish state. And in some ways that's appealing. It would look good on a map. You could separate different ethnic and sectarian groups. The long-term ramifications, though, would mean you would have a much smaller Iraqi state that would be Shia dominant, based on Baghdad in the south. It would be much poorer because it would not have access to Kurdish oil. You would have a Turkey that would be extremely angry because a Kurdish state had been created on its border. And if Turkey is worried about anything, it's worried about ethnic Kurdish threats to Turkish identity. There have been Turkish national liberation and terrorist groups operating in Turkey for 50 years or more. So you could see a geographic solution, but with the geographic solution would come additional problems. And among those problems would be, I think, again, great frustration in the Gulf states, who would be worried that Shia was creeping much closer to them with a new, smaller Shia majoritarian Iraq. So that would be a trade-off. That might happen as a result of a generation of bloodshed. It is an entirely feasible possibility. I'm not sure it's a desirable one, but it is a possible future.
You have to also account for demographic shifts, regionally and internally within countries as well, as my colleague said. Think about the India-Pakistan partition and how painful and bloody that was.
Yeah.
We got one more up here, then I'm going to come down to the lower level.
Obviously, the United States is one of the dominant world powers. Do you think that it will take an attack by ISIS on American soil for the United States to do something significant to stop ISIS and the war in Syria?
I think if ISIS attacks the United States, there will be enormous pressure to do something more dramatic. I think it's easy, remembering 9/11, to believe that as a result we would automatically do something more dramatic. I suspect it would probably depend on the nature of the attack and how deadly it was, how carefully it was organized. There would be a whole series of factors that might be involved. I think it is actually possible, to me, another future. I know I keep talking about different futures, but that's all I can do. Another possible future would be if Iraq gets its act together. If the Iraqi government is able to not only train a fairly capable military force and indicate that it will take some of this territory back, but also give the right indications to the Sunni community in Iraq that it would be willing to allow them autonomy or a great deal of freedom. That might be more likely to get us to intervene than anything else. I think the main constraint right now in some ways is lack of a partner who will be there after it's over and make it better. Because if you think about it, the United States has gone into this part of the world, northwestern Iraq. We've gone in twice. We went in 2003 and we overthrew the government of Saddam Hussein and we created chaos. And from that chaos arose Al-Qaeda. And so we went in and we cleaned out Al-Qaeda in from 2006 to 2008 with the military surge. And from that came ISIS. And if we go in and do it again, but then we leave and there's no one there to govern the place and reincorporate it into an Iraq that will function, then we'll probably just have another bad result. We'll kill a lot of people. Some of them will be the right people, some of them will be the wrong people, but at the end of the day, it will be an exercise in bloodshed that does not have the long-term strategic effect we seek. To get that long-term effect, we need to have an Iraqi government that will make that part of Iraq feel less threatened and more welcomed. And we can't control that. We can influence it, but we can't control it. I would think if it looks like we have that Iraqi government, we are more likely to go than anything else I can think of, including even a mild attack, terrorist attack in the United States.
Also, don't forget, ISIS is not the only bad guy out there. We have AQAP, which is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, which as of today just took over 2 towns. And they're the ones who really aggressively are trying to attack the United States. So it's not just, it's like whack-a-mole. It's not just ISIS. It's a whole bunch of guys, but especially AQAP in Yemen and the whole Al-Qaeda legacy. The rising from the ashes of Iraq is absolutely 100% correct. How do you burn ashes?
Professors, I would like to shift this just quickly to North Africa and talk about Libya really quick. And with the theme about legacy, I would like to focus on 2011 and the NATO intervention. Looking back on that, should there have been a stabilization force after the airstrikes, which led to Gaddafi falling, and 4 years afterwards, looking at this safe haven that has been created, should there have been a force on the ground in 2011?
It's a non-question. You know why it's a non-question? Because of sovereignty. And the Libyans said from day one of the NATO campaign and leading up to it, we don't want any ground troops. And sovereignty gives them the right to do so. Now that there's complete chaos and no one really knows who's in charge, and there's sort of a pseudo-interim government, which is supposedly aligned with the Western powers, maybe with the say of that very weak government or powerless government, we might have the green light and go ahead. But at the time, absolutely not. All of the fighters, all of the militias that were anti-Gaddafi said, and even the civilians said, no boots on the ground, but please give us the air protection.
I also would caution, we tend to think that inserting forces automatically changes the situation and turns it from one of conflict into one of peacekeeping. In fact, often it simply transitions from one of conflict within the society to conflict against the peacekeepers. It's not clear to me at all that any number of NATO troops in Libya would have brought stability and order. Because there are a number of different competing factions. As we saw in Benghazi, they can organize rather rapidly and effectively. They would have targeted peacekeepers. There was no obvious successor to the Gaddafi regime, and therefore what you would have had, that force, if it had gone in, would quickly have turned into an occupation force. And we know the problems of occupation forces. We've seen that in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm not sure that would have been an easy solution.
Yeah, and I'm sad to add the footnote that look at Afghanistan. I mean, we have the Taliban rising, and if you saw Frontline's latest documentary, there's even an ISIS cell in Afghanistan now. So, was it 14 years later?
Hands again, if you're interested, I'll come to you.
Yeah, Dr. Alvi, you mentioned social media, so war of ideas, ISIS recruitment. what role is social media playing for ISIS recruitment, and what are we, or U.S. policy, doing about it, if anything?
Yeah, very good question. In fact, we're just seeing headlines that U.S. Homeland Security and law enforcement, FBI, etc., are really clamping down on this. And an article just came out within the last 24 hours. You can see it in Reuters and a few other sources that there's an estimate of, gosh, I forgot the exact number. I want to say roughly 300 ISIS recruiters in the United States, and they've already arrested up to about 100 of them, maybe 70 to 100. So the United States law enforcement and various interagency groupings are starting to clamp down, but it's like a hamster in a wheel. And I say that because, and again, I'm not saying our efforts are not good. They're very good. They have to go after the suspects and especially the recruiters because they are so effective. But the problem is it's when ISIS has an account online shut down, like let's say the equivalent of Twitter or Facebook, an account of one ISIS recruiter is shut down, he or she already has a backup of at least 10 other accounts, at least 10, if not more. And they already tell their followers on Twitter and whatever other venues that if I'm shut out, go to this one. If I'm shut out in this one, go to that one. So they already have their ducks in order regarding recruitment and propaganda dissemination.
One of the more effective attacks just recently, actually, Anonymous has declared war on ISIS, and the older generation may not understand this, but they've been rickrolling ISIS sites and putting up silly videos and doing all kinds of other things to embarrass and humiliate all the ISIS sites that they can find. We're in a very dicey area here. To deal with ISIS and its cyber component, you need to be able to do the kinds of things that Snowden revealed. And people are very uncomfortable with that level of potential invasion of their personal privacy and their electronic privacy. At the same time, if you want to go after ISIS, which is very clever and very capable in the electronic environment, those are the kinds of legal permissions that you need, and those are the kinds of activities you need to carry out. And balancing that is a constant tension in American society. We swung heavily into invasiveness after 9/11 for reasons that are understandable. We have swung back in the other direction 10 or 15 years after 9/11 because people feel less comfortable about that. It may be that if ISIS is particularly effective, you'll see the pendulum move back partway.
There's
I just got a letter in the mail from OMB that said my security clearance has been hacked. All my information is out there, so what do I care?
We've had that. We've had that leather. We feel your pain.
also U.S. State Department has since, I think, late last year put up a Twitter kind of battle with ISIS and ISIS sympathizers on Twitter that's called Look Again, Turn Away, which is targeting would-be or potential recruits into ISIS, young men and women, or of various ages, I'm sure, but mainly young, who might be looking at ISIS sites or following Twitter handles that are ISIS handles. And the U.S. State Department has this Twitter insertion saying, look what ISIS is really about, look again, turn away. Now, the flip side of that is it's the U.S. government.
Yeah.
So people are going to be suspicious of that.
Dr. Alvi, you mentioned early on that thank you. Dr. Alvi, you mentioned early on that there was no military solution for the ISIS problem, that it's a battle of ideas. My question is, could you speculate on how you might do battle with their ideology?
Yeah, thank you. I should have expected that question.
You raised it.
I know, I walked
it's your hot
into it.
potato.
Yes, I know. So actually, it's something I'm quite passionate about, and a good source about this is a young man, well, he used to be young when he just came out of being an extremist, Pakistani heritage, British born and raised. His name is Majid Nawaz, N-A-W-A-Z. And Majid Nawaz, you can see a 60 Minutes CBS segment about him. It's a great profile from a few years back. He used to be an extremist and left after a series of stages and events and experiences in his life as a member of an Islamic extremist organization in the UK, and then turned around and now fights against extremist ideologies. And being an insider before, he knows which buttons to push. By the way, the 60 Minutes segment is called the narrative. And what he does is he fights against the narrative. And coming from someone who used to be an extremist, as opposed to the U.S. State Department, carries far more value and weight than someone who has not been in his shoes. He also has a book, and I'm not really pitching the book, but if you're interested, you can look him up and read his book. It's an autobiography about his experience. We need more Majid Nawazes in the world, in the Muslim world, all over the world, not just in the Middle East, not just in the UK, but everywhere, every corner of the earth, because this is an existential ideological battle for peaceful, moderate Islam, which is mainstream Islam, against all forms of extremism, which includes Wahhabism, Sunni extremism, and Shia extremism as well. The Muslims in the world, in my view, have the imperative and the obligation to take on this fight. And I always cite Majid Nawaz as an example. We need more of him to do so. So that's the internal battle. Externally, keep trying to delegitimize the message and the narrative of the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and that includes Boko Haram, that includes Al-Shabaab, that includes AQAP, and the Taliban, that their narrative, their take on their inhumanity of how they approach others is completely unacceptable. Be intolerant to intolerance is my motto.
I think another aspect, we know something about statistics about terrorism. In 2014, about 35,000 people died from acts of terrorism. Most of them were Muslims. 80% of them were in 7 countries where there are civil wars going on, where Nigeria, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen. We know that most of the terrorism in the world actually targets Muslims. And that's an important message. As Americans, most of us aren't Muslims. It's hard for us to tell other people what their faith should be. But what we can do is we can accentuate what people who act in extreme ways on behalf of their faith have done. And pointing out that most of these deaths are innocent Muslims inside Muslim countries who are targeted by people who want to seize political power in order to bring back a vision of Islam that almost no one in the faith agrees with. That may be the most powerful message that we can help convey, and it's something that we should be doing systematically and helping all of our partners and allies do as well.
Yes, thank you. We spoke earlier about how the removal of troops from the Middle East has contributed to the success and the spread of the Islamic State in the Middle East. And we also talked earlier about how the focus right now, the two main focuses, destroying ISIS and removing Assad. My question is there a history lesson here from previous invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan where we removed powers and we've seen the consequences, and is there going to be some sort of a domestic public opinion battle? Because as we know, the removal of power comes with a string, and as we've seen from what has happened, you can't just remove them from power and walk out. So how is this going to play out is my question.
I think one of the main reasons President Obama has been extremely reluctant to intervene in Syria is because he looks at history and he says, wow, we removed a dictator in Iraq and created chaos. We removed a repressive regime in Afghanistan, and that led to a very difficult situation, which still remains unresolved. We deposed a dictator in Libya, and that led to chaos. Even though we don't like Assad, it's not clear that the United States removing Assad from power will have any positive effect on Syria. Now, there's a serious debate about that in the United States right now, and that debate is only going to heat up. Many of the critics of the Obama administration are not just critics of the Obama administration's approach to ISIS. They are also critics of the Obama administration's approach to Assad. And in fact, many of the most cogent critics say, first knock Assad out, and then go after ISIS. Now, again, that's a possible future, but it's a very difficult one, especially now that the Russians are in country. I think the idea of knocking Assad out at this point, while the Russians are on the ground in force protecting him, is pretty much non-plausible. However, I would not be at this point surprised by anything that comes out of the presidential debates. I have heard virtually every option imaginable, and I think there are probably a few more floating out there that I haven't imagined. My guess is it would take a significant event for the Obama administration to change course. However, there will obviously be a major debate on ISIS in 2017 by the new administration, whichever one it is, that is going to look at options. If we recall, though, when George W. Bush was elected, the first thing that he did, Bush 43, the first thing he did when he came into office was to review options on Iraq. And they came out with a paper in June 2001 where they said, our options on Iraq aren't good. We can't really change this much. It was only after 9/11 that options changed on Iraq. It may be that the new administration, whatever party, will review Syria and come to the same conclusion. All of our choices are bad, and it may be the least bad is what we're doing now.
The history lesson in all of this that I think we all fail to grasp, and by we I mean especially Western powers, historically and up till now, is that the problem isn't necessarily the dictators and the question of removing them. The problem is, even with our allies and friends, is the issue of governance and good governance. Because then, if you had good governance, you wouldn't have Arab Spring. If you had no corruption, or if you didn't have the unbearable corruption that you had in Tunisia, you wouldn't have had the Arab Spring. So even when I lived in Egypt, which was for 4 years during Mubarak, when I spoke to Egyptian students about democracy, they would laugh and say, well, it's your government that's supporting our dictator, right? Who doesn't give a crap about democracy or human rights, and this is all symbolic and cosmetic in speeches, right? When it comes to policy, you're actually supplying Mubarak with arms and other kinds of assistance, which, because of the corruption, often goes into the pockets of the elite, the political elite, as well as in many cases today, the military, right? And so the question then goes full circle. It's not just the issue of a Gaddafi or a Ben Ali or a Mubarak or removing Assad. It's the question of even, and I agree with, actually I disagree with my colleague on this point, going back to Wahhabism, which is to say, okay, don't spread things about me at work tomorrow, which is to say, I don't believe there's a statute of limitation on accountability. And so with everything that's happened already, there's still opportunity to bring the Iranians, because of the Iranian nuclear deal, to account for a lot of things, but also, more importantly today, the Saudis. Okay? So don't assume it's just the bad dictators like Assad. A lot of our friends, have similar characteristics at the end of the day.
So we'd like to try to wrap these events by 8:30, but there are like 10 other people who have asked questions. So we're going to move into the lightning round here, okay? So quick questions, quick answers, maybe only one person answers, and then we'll get as many people packed in as we can, okay? I see you, folks.
Hi, I believe that there'll be no peace in the Middle East until the oil runs out. And I wondered if you know what the reserves are in countries in the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and what have you, how long they'll last?
Well, if you're talking about the Sunni-Shia rivalry, that was centuries before oil ever was discovered. So
I believe Saudi reserves are extremely robust. I believe Iraqi reserves are extremely robust. The decline in the price of oil has hurt the economies of all of the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia has been badly hurt by the lower cost of oil, but so has the UAE, so has Qatar, so has Iran. Again, that's a future. But the downside of that future is what happens then if all of those governments, which have barely kept a lid on their populations, then collapse because they can no longer deliver the goods.
right.
Saudi Arabia without the monarchy could be a much more violent place than Syria, and it could export that violence in much more unpleasant ways. For all that we might criticize the monarchy has calibrated radicalism. It has used it as a tool.
Correct.
Without a government to control that, and the same might be true of Iran, without a government to control that, things might get worse and not better.
Okay, lightning round, so we're going to move, okay?
Lightning.
Hi. The Assad regime in Syria has lasted for over 40 years, meaning his Bashar and his father. And Bashar himself started his ruling in 2000. So why do you think the war has started only recently?
Great question.
Well, if we're looking only in the context of the Arab Spring, then we're talking about 2011. But that goes back to my earlier comment that I used to laugh at people when they told me Assad will fall in 6 months. And by the way, when he falls, or when he's out of the picture, that's when the real fighting begins, in my opinion.
Lightning round.
Okay. Following World War II, you had the Marshall Plan that helped rebuild Europe and also Japan. So going back to 2003 with post-war Iraq and now with Libya, should we have done the same thing, a big Marshall Plan, something similar to that?
Question.
I think what we have seen with the massive influx of American money into both Iraq and Afghanistan is that it has only fueled corruption. I don't know why it didn't do that in Western Europe from 1948 to 1952, but what we've seen very clearly in both Iraq and Afghanistan is it has had some economic it has spurred some economic investment and improvements, but a lot of the money has disappeared into patron-client networks and has only fueled corruption that already existed. So I don't know why that is. Unfortunately, my economics background is just not good enough to handle that.
Lightning round.
Despite the recent rise of terrorism linked to ISIS, I see that more politicians are actually making the discussion about climate change and its apparent link. So are they truly linked, or is this a seeming way to bring less significance to more immediate issues at stake right now, or is this just your typical ideological divide and what's a priority for our country?
Terrorism is inherently linked to a lot of climate issues. One of which is poaching of wildlife in Africa, and they're involved in that trade. That includes Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and a host of other AQIM, that's Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And of course, their involvement in oil. In Libya, by the way, ISIS has expanded its foothold in Libya, and they're eyeing the oil facilities there. Of course, we've talked about ISIS and its oil assets in Syria and Iraq. So yeah, there is a linkage.
I would just say, to add to that, in In the Middle East generally, even without climate change, there are two major factors that will have some impact on radicalization. One is the youth bulge. Very rapid growth rates in many societies, large families, declining median age of the population, which means you're going to have a lot of angry, young, unemployed people, which is a possible source of radicalization. The other is simply access to water, which is going to increasingly become a problem in states with much larger populations. How do you manage that problem? That, again, may fuel discontent and radicalization.
Yeah, Yemen's going to run out of water in about 5 years. And for sure, AQAP is going to exploit that somehow.
At the risk of just blatant self-promotion, I am actually teaching a university seminar next semester on national security and climate change. So I'm just saying, it's, you know, it's available. We got time, I think, for one more.
No-fly zone, favor or against?
I think it might have been possible 3 or 4 months ago. I think it would have been a bad idea then. I think now that you have Russian aircraft defending Assad's airspace, it's a really, really crazy idea. People who support it don't recognize that the first thing that happens when you have a no-fly zone is that it makes people on the ground safe. So the second thing that happens is a whole lot of militants will go in there because it's safe, which then means Syrian forces will come in on the ground, not flying, on the ground, and massacre people, which will then make the no-fly zone not safe. We've seen this happen in Iraq before. This is exactly what happened in 1995, 1996 in northern Iraq. It led to the Iraqi army carrying out the Erbil offensive against the Kurds. A no-fly zone sounds really good. It's really kind of phony. If you think it through, it doesn't work, especially in a war zone.
Folks, it is, we're past the witching hour. We try to cut it sharp because we want you to come back to the next one. This is a wonderful topic. You see why these are two of my favorite speakers. Hayat, Alvi, Tim Hoyt, thank you so much. And this is it for our fall speaker series. Look for information about the spring semester in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, I wish you all a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year. Thank you for being here.